Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the show. We've got a great one for you today. I know I say that every week, but this one I'm particularly really excited for. We have Eyla Cuenca, who is a holistic birthing guide. She's awesome. She's the first one who introduced me to Goda on her Alpha Vedic podcast. And if you haven't listened to that one, that's Ricky Stanzi, a couple episodes back. Go check it out. It's awesome. And we had a great conversation today. It was awesome. I was particularly kind of nervous, or I don't know if that's the right word, but being a man, not having any kids on the way or anything like that, I was curious as to how to approach this conversation. And it was really, really fantastic. She was so gracious with her time and her answers and everything. I really enjoyed it. I think you guys will as well. Really quick, check out all the links in the description below. And if you're interested in anything, please go check them out and use any of the discount codes that I have or anything like that, because it really helps support the show, support me, helps me do this even more. And if you're interested to learn a bit more about the things that are in the description, stay to the end of the episode. And I've got a little bit of adverts to show you how they've helped me and hopefully how they will help you. So, all right, enough of that. Let's get into the show. Okay, everybody, welcome back to Dig Within. Today, I have Holistic Birthing Guide, providing empowered education from preconception to parenting. Her work strives to connect women, parents, and children through the scope of conception, birth, and parenting. As a birth guide, she draws on a blend of ancient traditions and evidence-based information to bring custom-tailored support to every individual, no matter where they are in their process. As a teacher and a birthing guide, she offers natural birth classes, prenatal and postpartum guidance consultations, Reiki energy healing, documentary birth photography, and highly individualized birth doula support. She provides support in person and online so that anyone, anywhere in the world has the opportunity to empowered birth education and guidance. Welcome to the show, Eyla Cuenca. How are you today?
I am so good. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you. It's interesting. I'm gonna sort of kick it off here a little bit, but just being as a guy in this space, not having kids and all that kind of stuff, I find myself attracted to this work. And another podcast I listen to a lot and mention a bunch on this show is Crow 777, and he has a lot of people doing natural births and talking about the importance of keeping the umbilical cord on and placenta and all that sort of stuff. And it's fascinating to me, but I always find it interesting that, like, as a guy with no kids, nothing on the way, is just like, am I strange for sort of paying attention to this and being fascinated by this? So I was wondering, first off, is there anything in the intro you'd like to expand upon before we kick off as to what you do and what you provide?
No, you got it.
Okay. So yeah, I have a friend who's a naturopath, and she takes a lot of breastfeeding courses and birthing courses to help people in that kind of regard. I know there's just like complete industries of natural healing in these kind of things. And I always find it fascinating. And I find it the actual women supporting women and all of this sort of feminist junk. But yeah, as a guy with no kids and none on the way and all that kind of stuff, why would your work be important to someone like me? Why do I find myself attracted to this, do you think?
Well, there's something that happens when we're in the womb, right? We're assimilating information from our mother and from our lineage. People focus a lot on nutrition and what the mother's taking in, and her physical activity. And what we don't think about are the cells that are being exchanged between the mother and baby while the baby's in the womb. So I find that man or woman, we have this natural inclination to understand this process because it's our origin. It's how we've formed, right? And so many men that I've worked with have tried all of these different modalities, in their mid-30s, 40s. They're on this path to healing. They're transitioning from one archetype to another, and this is their time to kind of like find some answers. And the modalities kind of work, but there's something missing. And then they start to tap into their birth. They start to look at what happened when my mother was pregnant. What was her relationship like with my father? What was she experiencing physically, emotionally, spiritually? And that starts to answer a lot of questions about our own miasms and our own patterning. And so for men who are really, interested in unlocking and becoming more conscious and aware, they go to birth. So I think it's just a natural inclination that you have. It's not that like it's weird that you want to learn about this process as a witness. It's more like you're actually just healing something within you, understanding how you arrived here, on this earth plane, right? So I think that's where that comes from. I mean, and there could be something else there for you, but really it's your origin story.
Right. And I got to be honest, out of all the guests that I've had, there's some people that are some of the things they speak about are way over my head kind of thing. But this is just so far off the deep end of even just the schism between masculine and feminine. Right. And not in, I guess, like a gendered kind of way, but in the actual sort of energetics, that this was one of the most, not intimidating, but I was just nervous. I was like, well, how do I come up with questions for this? What do I talk about in this kind of space? Cause it's so, I guess, different from just being a guy and doing guy stuff and being interested in guy stuff. So I just was, I'm really, researching some of your other interviews that you've had. Some of the things you brought up were so thought provoking to me, even just in terms of remembering your birth story. And it made me really think, like, I don't know if I've ever really thought about that, but I'm wondering if my attraction to things like home birth, especially with what's going on in the world right now, I definitely don't want to go anywhere near a hospital, but I'm wondering if that has any sort of underlying trauma with that. Just in my personal case, I've never really asked my mom about those things, and I don't think there was anything hugely complicated, but I'm wondering if that's sort of some push to have this interest of mine to talk to you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when we start to examine our romantic relationships, our erotic relationships, the root of that, the foundation of that is our mother relationship, right? There's like this, we all have varying degrees of this like mother wound. And so in the process of uncovering how we function and our patternings in partnership, we naturally will look to this relationship with our mother. And a lot of people who say, yeah, everything's cool, everything with my mom is fine, no issues there. I'm always like, well, ask her about your birth. Oh, I've never talked to her about my birth. Oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know that information. So there is no, like, we start to uncover that there is no actual understanding of that dynamic. Right. And we've kept it very much on a surface level. And when we start to uncover that relationship with our mother, we'll discover some beautiful things there and some painful things that will then expose how we're functioning in our current relationships and dynamics. I think that's really valuable, we focus so much on the object, right? Like this person, this mirror, my partner. And we don't look at where we originally learned how to relate, which was the mother, not so much the father. People always say, oh, the father wound, she's got daddy issues. And I'm like, yeah, it really starts with the mother. It starts in gestation. Was the mother, when you were in the womb, was your mother experiencing infidelity with her husband? Was he cheating on her? Did she feel like she was in fight or flight? Was she experiencing betrayal? All of those sensations, if we look at microchimerism, like all of those sensations and that cell memory is being transferred to the fetus, right? Then that child grows up having these like unconscious wounds of betrayal and the sensation that they can't trust anyone and they don't know where it comes from because mommy and daddy were there every step of the way. They're not coming from a divorced family, right? Everything on paper looks perfect. So what are these deep rooted sensations of infidelity, betrayal that they feel, and why can't they open up to partnership? Right. And so we can learn so much about ourselves by understanding our mother's mental emotional state and build compassion for her as well. And then we stop blaming our partner and we stop blaming the person that's in front of us. They're simply mirroring something back to us. And it's our responsibility to then go deeper and find out, where did this come from?
That's so fascinating. That makes me think of, I forget the gentleman's name, but it was on Paul Chek's podcast and he was talking about past lives and even the idea of going through trauma while you're the being in the womb and there's trauma going on in the mother. And there was a story that someone had, she had this a young woman had a predilection to cut herself, and they had no idea what was going on, but she just would cut her wrists and stuff. And then I think it was through this work they realized that either the grandmother or the mother at the time got in a car crash, and the husband flew through the window and he was cut, and he had these cuts on all over himself, right? And he bled out, and that trauma effectively was so deep that it was in the womb with her, and she carried that into her life. And it's fascinating that to pay attention to those kind of things too. And it's, I guess, healing, the sins of the father, they say, like in the Bible and stuff like that, is like, you have no idea how far down it can reverberate to fix yourself for your future generations.
Right. Yeah, that's so fascinating. And that's why I really like Bert Ellinger's work, the family constellation work, because you can, through this quantum field, access people in your lineage that you've never met, you'll never meet, who have long since passed in the physical, right? And you can settle contracts. You can acknowledge perpetrators who are keeping this schism going in the family lineage that are now affecting you and going to affect your children. And you can integrate them. You can say to them, I take you in. Perpetrator or not, you've served a purpose in this lineage and we're no longer rejecting you. And once they're integrated, you have now integrated that part of yourself, because to reject something in your lineage, to reject your mother, reject your father, you're rejecting a piece of yourself. So how can you fully be, espousing these ideas of self-worth and self-love, and I'm an integrated being and I'm, on my path to enlightenment, when you still have not integrated or accepted people in your lineage, your ancestry?
And it reminds me a lot of the work that I find a lot of men are lacking nowadays is this idea of, either going to the gym or being successful in business and all that kind of stuff, which is important, and keeping yourself in that kind of regard. But a lot of men have no concept of a divine feminine within them that they need to actualize in real life, for one, to support their partner, but two, to become a fully realized being too, right? The idea of the feminine being the receptive, creative force, the idea generative force, and then the masculine directive force of accomplishing that thing as well, right? And I think that personally, that's why I think I am attracted to this work that you're doing, is because it's that combination of both, because the two of you need to bring this being into existence. And when you talk about a lot about, maybe you can dive into the father's role of pregnancy and of birthing, and the idea that when they're not embodying that divine feminine for their partner in that regard, the woman has to do everything, and it just makes a total just shit show of the entire experience. And I was wondering if you maybe want to unpack that a little bit. It's like, what's the father's role in that regard, and how do they step into that?
Right. So first, when I witness, as a birth worker, as an outsider, and working with couples, when I witness that the father has not integrated the mother, there is this rejection and almost this loathing of the feminine, right? And so he does not regard his wife, girlfriend, partner as the oracle, because he's still rejecting something about his own mother, and therefore, cannot fully integrate this divine feminine that lives within his partner. And so then he's in this low frequency where he actually becomes the hysterical low frequency feminine, and takes the stage. And then the woman ends up, the feminine in the dynamic, the woman ends up being the one to hold that more masculine space, to make sure he's okay, to manage his hysteria, so that, it becomes this kind of codependent dynamic. And then the masculine then gets frustrated because he can't be in his masculine because she's taking over the masculine role. So it's like this ping pong game, and no one can figure out who's steering the ship. And so I find that it really does start with the male having to integrate that mother wound, figure out what it is, heal it to the best of their abilities. It's always a process. It's not like one day it's just healed. It's ongoing. But once he can do that, he can then integrate the feminine into himself. I look at it like ratios, like maybe 20% feminine exists in the man. Biologically, he is predisposed to be in that masculine energy. But that feminine lives within him. And if he can find that balance and he can honor that in his partner, he can honor that in himself. And same with the feminine. Like, there are some women who are so saturated in the feminine that it's like trying to get a kite to come down. It's just like, oh, late everywhere, can't figure out what you want to do. Like, oh, I forgot to eat dinner. Like, oh, I forgot this commitment. And it's just like, they haven't integrated something about the masculine. They're in the rejection of the masculine in some way. And we see it expressed in so many different ways. So I would say that, again, integrating both parents into our identity is super important. Then the masculine has this beautiful role to play, right? They're co-creating life together. They come together, the man and the woman, and they create this third body, arguably God, right? That's the third body that comes from this coming together. Some people call it Shekhinah, which is this Hebrew word for an angel. It's like this third divine body, Eros. And so that's the responsibility in itself. Biologically, that's the role that the male serves at that time of conception. And then they have to make sure that the woman can nourish herself, can house this baby, grow this baby. And how do they do that? They become responsible for going out and taking action. They become responsible for providing so that the woman doesn't have to be in fight or flight. She doesn't have to be in her masculine. Her hormones don't have to go haywire in order to make sure that she survives. And then at the time of the birth, there's a really beautiful role that the man can play. The man doesn't have to be down on his knees, catching the baby, being involved in all of the more bodily functions of this process, unless they want to be, but they don't have to be. I look at them really as gatekeepers, and that's why it becomes very tricky in the hospital, because they can't be in that masculine, action-oriented, discerning role in the hospital, because they are completely shrunken by the system. Like, they go in, you basically are giving up your rights. Everything that you sign in the hospital is basically paperwork stating that whatever the hospital or the staff decides is best, you are agreeing to that. And it becomes very difficult to assert yourself and your preferences once you're in that setting. And so it's very emasculating. And that's why in this process, if your partner is saying, I'd like to do a home birth, I'd like to work with a midwife, acknowledge her as the oracle who knows what is right for her body and for this family. And then you, as the action taker, help her find the right resources for this. You make it possible for this to happen. You trust her judgment about her own body, and you work together to make this dream come true. And so I look at the masculine as the gatekeeper for this process, making sure that everything in the home during the birth is safe. There are no strangers in there. The woman has everything she needs so she can fully surrender. Because if he doesn't do this, then she can't fully surrender, and this can interrupt the labor and the birthing process. So this role that the masculine plays is very, very important. Traditionally, men were outside of the birthing hut, making sure that predators were not coming towards the hut, because, predators, lions, things like that could smell the birth. They could smell the blood. They could smell the fluids. And so men had to make sure that that area was protected. All the men would do it together. Definitely the husband was a part of that. They would make sure that there was food available for the woman after the birth, so that she had, she had a meal, she had nourishment. So the man's role in this process is very important. And it's almost like the needle point of the entire picture, which is that ultimately this is the biological purpose that they serve for the first few years of the child's life anyway. A lot of people say, oh, well, we split everything 50-50, right? He does bottles at this time, I do this so I could go to my Pilates classes, and I get to work, and we both contribute financially. And I said, oh, okay. And how does everybody feel? And usually the feedback I get is that it doesn't feel balanced. They don't feel happy. Something is missing. There's frustration, and they can't quite pinpoint why. And it's because the man is too much in a feminine masculine role, and the woman is too much in a feminine masculine role. It's not supposed to be equal in that way. The division of labor is equal, but the roles are very different. And so I encourage women to look at that. How can you be in your feminine? You breastfeed, you stay home, you nourish your body. You're not worrying about going out and getting food and making sure that the mortgage is paid. That is the role of the masculine. And they say, well, how long should my husband stay at home with me and the baby after the baby's born? I'm like, I don't know, 3 to 4 days. They're like, that's it? Shouldn't he be here for months and weeks and family bonding? I said, yeah, but who's going to pay the bills? Right? And no, after 4 days, men are like, oh my God, what am I doing here? This is not my rhythm. Hormonally, this is not my space or my rhythm. And so why do they need to go against their natural inclinations? Because society is telling you that everything's 50-50. Traditionally, men would start to fill that father role directly with the child once the child was old enough to go out to learn, to start to hunt, to be in the world. They say that the mother is responsible for bringing them into the world, and then the father is responsible for showing them how to be in the world. And so that time frame is very different. And people say, well, how is the father going to bond with the baby if the father's not feeding the baby? I'm like, father can feed the baby when the baby's eating food, maybe in 2 or 3 years. Why? There's no biological importance or validity here for the father to be feeding the baby. Oh, how is she going to know who her father is? I'm like, by the voice and by having safety and security in this shelter, So the father's role is incredibly important, just as important as the mother's role, but the roles are very different.
Right. And this can go in so many different directions as to how they're trying to confuse those roles and, you know, in society and all that kind of stuff. It really made me think there too. You're talking about men keeping the predators away. And it's funny that nowadays the predators are the ones that are in the room trying to get you to do certain things in a hospital, right? Those are the ones that you kind of actually have to watch out for. But I think the COVID situation is it's presenting a fascinating opportunity for people to move into the space that you kind of live in, right? Where people are going, I think probably more in droves to find doulas, to find people to do natural home births, midwives, and all that kind of stuff. But I was wondering, for one, do you see that? And two, how do you think we got to the situation? Like, what's the history from going from into the hut and the sort of community coming together to sort of um, have this process be what it is, to going into a sterile environment with fluorescent lights and all these different things? Like, how did we kind of get there?
Well, somewhere around the 1500s, it started becoming fashionable women were birthing in churches in the presence of church community males, under the eyes of God, and women started birthing with physicians, right, in the Edwardian into the Victorian era. And it was just more fashionable. That's what you did. If you had money and if you had clout, you were able to afford this male physician to come in. And it's a pretty layered, intricate history as to how Rockefeller medicine came in and basically hijacked birth. But it didn't really become official until, I'd say, like the 1890s, where hospitals figured out, like, oh, there's women birthing every day. How do we create like a department or a wing in our hospital where women can come to birth? Because this is a cash cow, right? Like, if women are coming in here, like 10 to 15 women a day, that's a significant amount of money. And then they had access to narcotics and different drugs. And so they started advertising, pain-free birth. And, for a period of time, we did see a decrease in postpartum mortality, meaning less women were dying of infection once they started birthing in hospitals because they had care in the hospital. Whereas, we look at really condensed areas like in London at the beginning of the 1900s, and a lot of women were dying of postpartum infection because they were living in cramped quarters in the city. There was no running water. They had 6 kids. So yeah, the conditions were not set up for the hut, right? The hut where women are birthing, it's one baby, everyone's helping her. We weren't having those issues. But when women started doing home births in cities and the conditions were disgusting and the food was processed, they were not getting postpartum nutrition. Yeah, it was like temporarily a better idea to be in the hospital because of the nursing care they'd get after the birth. But then very quickly, many women became addicted to the idea of a pain-free birth. And then we started seeing a lot of fetal mortality happening because of all of the drugs. And then there was a big push. I think it was Similac in 1914 released the first powdered formula. And then it was like a big push to be like, oh, birth in the hospital, it's pain-free. And then guess what? We have this really amazing formula to feed your baby, and you don't have to worry about the troubles of breastfeeding. You already have other kids at home. You can give this over to your nanny or to whoever's taking care. And it kind of looked like this more upper class thing to not be sitting there breastfeeding your child. You could go and do other things that were more ladylike, maybe more modest and less burdensome. So there were a lot of psychological, societal shifts happening. There was this enculturation of this idea that, doing things at home meant you were poor, meant that you were low class. And then if you were birthing in the hospital, you pay a little more money and you had this really kind of clean, sterile experience with a lot of staff and help and support. And then by the 1940s, probably 60% of women in the US were birthing in hospitals. And then now it's like 98% of women are birthing in hospitals. Midwifery care, home birth made a comeback in the 70s because a lot of people started questioning the government after Vietnam, after the war. And so there was this kind of revolt against the system. And, as soon as that happened, then there was a big advertising push to get women back in hospitals, releasing a lot of information that home birth was unsafe, dangerous, irresponsible, midwives were witches, right? And so then there's always this push pull. And now we have a highly regulated midwifery system. And even doulas now, like who was it? Someone running for mayor in New York. I forget his name. He didn't win, but he really wanted to create this government program where doulas were getting paid by Medicaid and different insurance companies to support women at their births. However, the doulas had to function under the umbrella of their restrictions. So they anytime they see an opportunity for women that's serving them, they'll try to kind of absorb it and then require that those doulas, midwives function under their umbrella of care. I was contacted so many times by insurance companies that were like, hey, we can send you clients. We just, these are our protocols. You have to function under these protocols in order to be covered. And I was like, I don't do that. I don't work for anyone. Nobody controls me. I'm a rogue agent. And that's the way I like it.
Yeah, it's like anything really nowadays, right? Your insurance, your license, your pension, your everything like this is actually a hindrance, but you don't know. And I think people are waking up to that, right? And I think that what you're talking about with Vietnam is exactly what's happening right now. And it's funny that you mentioned the formula stuff, because I was wondering your opinion on this crazy formula psyop that's going on right now, and just the idea of your work. And if people paid attention to these kind of things, and when we're breastfeeding and we're at home and all that kind of stuff and doing these things naturally, this wouldn't even be an issue.
Yeah, but there's so much brainwashing around this idea that breastfeeding is a privilege. Oh, only women who are lucky and, rich and have husbands who take care of them can breastfeed. But what about all us other women who have to work? You don't realize that they've been brainwashed by this feminist movement that has made women believe over the last few decades that in order to be valuable in society, they have to work and provide children and have hobbies and function this way. And so now they're like, I've heard women say the ball and chain of breastfeeding, right? And so there's that whole layer to it, where women believe that it's something that only the few and the lucky and the wealthy can do. And really, I believe it's something that women who truly want to be autonomous actually build conviction and commit to doing it. And it's actually very rare that a woman cannot breastfeed because of some sort of biological dysfunction that either she or the baby has. A lot of it is psychological and cultural as to why women are not breastfeeding. And a lot of it has to do with the traumatic birth that they've had that prevents them from breastfeeding. Once you've sustained a really deep physical and psychological trauma, which is what happens often at birth in the hospital, women are incapable of opening themselves up to breastfeeding. You have to be nourished and rested and supported to breastfeed. And women often are not in a hospital setting. So that's a whole other thing. But the formula shortage, people have been saying that because we have such high restrictions, that the FDA is so detail oriented and has such high standards of what formula should have in it, shouldn't have in it, that we've become very dependent on trade, and getting our formula from certain sources that are just perfect. And if we just produced it here in the US, then we wouldn't have these issues when things like coronavirus strike, that we wouldn't have these embargoes or whatever. And then, some people say that there's so many opinions as to why it's happening. I'll just say what I believe. BioMilk with the Q at the end. I learned about them right before pandemic started, and they're a North Carolina-based woman-owned company that's taking breast milk cells, mammary cells, and they're reproducing human breast milk in a lab. And so they kind of came out publicly, I'd say January 2020. And then I learned that Bill Gates was their main funder, and the head of BioMilk actually used to work for the Gates Foundation. And so I was like, oh, here we go. I was like, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to have a formula shortage, because what's going to happen is that all of these breast milk, human milk labs are going to buy out formula companies. And then we're going to pretend like there's some sort of shortage because we're not a one world order, right? Because the whole argument is that if we were a one world order and we had free trade and we had all this and we were globalized, we wouldn't have shortages, because everybody would be sharing and trading easily and peacefully, right? And so again, we're trying to eliminate borders because we want a one world order. So this is the push, right? And so I think what's happening right now is that all of these human milk companies have paid off artificial formula companies, and this is just the way that they're getting edged out, you know. And they're saying, oh, there's an outbreak of this bacteria at a lab in Michigan at a formula production company. And, you know, if we were just making, you know, breast milk in a lab from, you know, human cells, and we wouldn't be having these issues. So it's like, it's all just being set up to edge out formula. What I really think needs to happen is that women need to educate themselves on birth and breastfeeding so that they don't even get into a situation where they need to rely on formula. Right.
And it's going back to nature. There is no lie in nature, and you know, we could avoid so many of these things just by going back to that. And you can see the exact same argument happening right now with the oil, right? And gas prices going through the roof. And you go, oh well, you know, it's a way around that is electric cars. Oh, by the way, you'd only be able to charge it from, you know, 1 hour away from your house. So you're in this like digital prison. You're in this like prison now too, where you can't get away from even your own home. And it's the lockdowns and whatnot. But it's so interesting that just like the kind of the lie that's happening over the past 2 years is that there is some sort of toxin or something like that that's getting you sick, and it could be a number of different things that we might know right now with frequencies and stuff like that they're introducing. But it's like what they're saying about if we had free trade and if we were able to just support each other in all these different ways, we just have this beautiful, you know, utopia and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, well, you guys own it all, and you know, we have to just kind of deal with it. But the ironic thing is like, but if we did that ourselves as individuals with through private members associations or contracting with each other and going, if you get contacted by that insurance company being like, I don't need you, I have no, it's like, you guys are correct, but in the wrong way. So like it's the same problem with deception, is that there's enough truth in the lie that they'll veer you off the course enough. But what they're saying is technically true. It's just up to us to do that ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can take it away at any moment, you know, and that's why they want us involved in that system, because they can just pull the formula at any moment. They could pull the biomilk at any moment. I mean, Israel is producing their own company. It's called Biomilk, except with a K. And I mean, but Israel's been on that for a long time. They produce their own agriculture. They even produce their own plastic. I mean, they're really trying to become fully independent. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But I think I think we just have to be really cautious about what we're becoming codependent on, you know, and in that awareness. And when we have that birth education, so many people who go through my masterclass, for example, afterwards say, wow, like, I don't feel like I need to go to the hospital to have this baby, because I understand what is a true risk, what is low risk, and birth is a natural, normal, physiological process. And I don't actually need any of those people or those monitors to tell me otherwise. Right. So there's like this emancipation from the system. And then from there, they can emancipate themselves from the pediatric system. And then they start to learn about terrain theory, and they start to understand that there are different ways to heal their own bodies and to keep their child safe and protected, you know, and it's not with a system that we become dependent on.
So for women who want to move into this space, and men who want to support their partners in that kind of regard too, there's this overarching kind of, I guess, cloud of, oh well, what if something happens, what if we need the hospital and that kind of stuff. I was wondering, like, what is the percentage of that actually, you know, you would 100% need to leave your home and go somewhere where you need that support and whatnot, and how much of that is just another psyop to get you away from the home. And I guess, yeah, we were in Ireland, and we went to my grandmother's house that she was born, you know, in like the 30s, in the home. And it's like, how the hell did we get away from the home and being like, well, I'm here because my grandma was born this way. But now in, you know, that kind of amount of time, we're like, no, if you're born at home, that is like super dangerous. Well, how the hell did we get here?
Well, I'll just say that fetal and maternal mortality rates are still incredibly high, even though 98% of women are birthing in hospitals. C-section rates are incredibly high. They're 68% nationwide. So how is it that we're birthing in the quote safest places we can, and we're still having all of these emergency C-sections? Whereas 100 years ago, the C-section rate was like 2%. And we weren't birthing primarily in hospitals. So if we look at it that way, we start to understand that it's the actual setting, which is the hospital, and all of the interventions that are then given to the women that make birth dangerous. right? It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. So as soon as you start adding more and more and more, you get farther and farther away from the natural normal process, and then you become dependent on the C-section or on the procedure. So we have to understand that, I mean, we're all in a fear matrix. I'm every day, I'm like slowly emancipating myself from that belief system that we need that in order to deal with the most outrageous, dangerous situation. You know, a lot of that has to do with a departure from believing in a benevolent universe or believing in God and believing that everything is done according to a plan that we can't control, right? But that's really triggering for a lot of people because God and religion seem to be very triggering for a lot of people. So anyway, I would say that it's really about dismantling the fear. So what are the fears? Because people will say, well, what if something happens? And I say, what are you imagining? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, give me a specific. What is this scary boogeyman that we're talking about? I don't know, something. So people can't even answer what is specific. They don't even know what the fear is. There's just a fear. So I'll say, what, the cord wrapped around the neck? And they're like, yeah, that, what if that happens? And I'm like, okay, so this is an opportunity for education. The baby does not breathe through their nose and throat when they're in the womb or at birth. They're receiving oxygen through the umbilical cord. So even if they were constricted at the throat, that's not going to inhibit their breathing. And they're like, oh, okay. And then there's this moment of like uncovering something new, right? So it's a process of going deep into what the fears are and then educating around them. And that might take someone an entire pregnancy to do. That's why I recommend that all of you who are even remotely interested in partnership, procreating, starting a family at any point in your life, just get this education now, because trying to learn all of this in the 10 months of a pregnancy is pretty challenging. It's possible for sure, but just start uncovering this now, and then you'll get you'll get this more profound understanding of how this entire system is set up to make us dependent. And it starts at birth, right? You have a traumatic birth with a lot of intervention, a lot of ultrasounds. The child then has some developmental issues and you become reliant on the pediatric system. And then from there, most likely reliant on physical therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, pharmaceuticals, and then the cycle continues, because then that child will then grow up to birth another child. They'll make the same choices. And then there we go. And now we're fully enculturated into this, conventional birthing system, pharmaceutical system.
It's fascinating that you mentioned actually voicing those concerns too, because that's just a very, you can use that in so many different aspects of your life too, right? And it's funny that people go to the point of bringing a life into this world and they haven't, developed that skill set to begin with of, okay, here's the worst case scenario that I'm imagining, and I'm going to list everything that's negative about that and what I'm afraid of. But people don't even know that. They just have the boogeyman over them, right? They just have that dark cloud, but they can't even voice about, okay, what actually is it? Can you say anything about it? Can you see what it is? What's the emotionality you have behind it? And they don't know. It's just there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with something, one thing that that I'm really curious about with that kind of cord around the neck and all that kind of stuff, what is the actual, you're saying like C-sections are through the roof. What's the actual, I guess, percentage of ones that would definitely need to have happen, especially
I think that's like what you actually asked me 10 minutes ago. Yeah, so I'd say probably 6% on average actually require high intervention C-section, so high intervention labor process and a C-section. However, one example might be the woman's in labor and her water releases, right? The amniotic sac rips and the quote water breaks. I don't like the water breaks because it sounds like kind of violent, but the water will release. And in the movies, we see the woman in the grocery store and all of a sudden there's like this fountain flowing from her, right? That's not typically what it looks like. It looks like you've kind of peed. That's what it feels like and looks like. So if her water releases and then the umbilical cord comes out, it's kind of just hanging there, that would be an emergency situation where she would have to then leave her home birth, go to the hospital and get a C-section, because when the baby attempts to come out through the vaginal canal, it'll compress its own cord if that cord is just hanging there, and it'll cut off its own oxygen supply. You can't just put the cord back up there and hope for the best, right? So that's a situation where you would have to do a C-section, and that's why they exist, for these rare instances, right? However, most women get C-sections because they opt to do an epidural because they have a fear of pain. They have a general ignorance around the birth process, which is very common. And this is not a judgment. It's just how we're educated as women in 2022, and so they get an epidural, and then the fentanyl in the epidural typically doesn't agree with the baby's heart, right? It's an opioid, and the baby's heart might decelerate. And then they'll say, baby's heart doesn't sound good, you need an emergency C-section. And so the woman now has a belief, and her whole family and her friends and everyone in her community has a belief, like, wow, she was young, she's 32, healthy, birth is dangerous. See, even someone like her experienced a really dangerous situation because birth is dangerous. And I'm like, no, everything was fine. She took fentanyl. That's why she had to have a C-section. But nobody wants to look at it that way. They just want to believe what's being told to us is that birth is dangerous and requires high intervention to be safe, and it has to be done in a hospital.
It's the exact same. I find it amazing that you can, through your work, can also put in these little nuggets of terrain theory and all that kind of stuff, because it's the same sort of concept, right? It's like, how could we have possibly got here if the conventional system right now, the allopathic model of birthing, how would we have gotten here if that's the case? There's no possible way. And the same thing with germ theory, right? It makes absolutely no sense. It's just, yeah, it just, as a man trying to have that conversation, especially I'm trying to think of a different topic as a woman talking about it to a guy, and the guys kind of brush her off or something like that. But it seems similar to women who have this mentality about hospital births too. And as a guy, I'm sort of like, I don't know if that's really the case. And it's like, oh, well, you would have no idea. You don't know what it's like, or all that kind of stuff, right? And it's just, I don't know, I just find it fascinating that it's like, it's the exact same conversation as what we're seeing happening in the world right now, where it wouldn't make sense if what you're saying is true.
Right. I mean, really, we've only been primarily birthing in hospitals for, let's say, 100 years. And look at the amount of sick children we have, more than ever before. And I know people want to blame it on, things that happen in newborn procedures. I do think that the things that are done to babies, the protocols promoted by the CDC, are damaging. However, we're negating what's happening in utero. The amount of ultrasounds that are happening given to women, the way that ultrasound wave technology will actually damage the microvilli on a cell, on the fetus. The fetal cells get damaged. They can no longer take in nourishment, can no longer secrete toxins. And so the cell dies and stops functioning properly. And people are wondering why, ADHD, ADD, autism numbers are so high, and they're blaming it on newborn procedures. There is a lot of validity to that. But I would encourage everyone to look deeply into what's happening in the womb and all of those procedures, what the mother's taking in as well, her food, the glyphosates, all of the toxins. And I know, I genuinely believe that if the terrain has integrity, and if the terrain is healthy, then a woman could take in all of that stuff and it wouldn't affect her. However, most terrains don't have that integrity because there's a lot of emotional discord in most of us. And it's the emotional discord, the spiritual discord, that creates a weak terrain.
And this is why I think a lot of people don't pay attention to health in the sort of the most, I guess, fundamental way, and being very extreme about it, is because it's everything. You have to change everything in your life, because it goes even like the work that you do, it's your birth, it's even before your birth. So it's just incredible. But you're mentioning ultrasounds, and that was one of the points that I had here was why. So you kind of described as to why you would avoid them, but what's the reasoning behind why they say you have to have them, and how is that not the case?
I mean, liability. So there are different authorities on childbirth, right? And there are different scopes. There's the legal scope. Many people look at birth through the legal scope. Many people look at birth through the clinical scope, right? What's the evidence? Many people look at it through the traditional scope. What have people been doing for thousands of years that has worked? And then some women look at it through my own female scope. What do I want and what do I think is important? So there are many scopes through which, and then there's the political. What are the laws that have been passed and what is politically, socially acceptable, right? People trying to control bills on women's bodies, things like that. So these are all the scopes through which childbirth can be viewed. And there's that liability component where that midwife, that doctor doesn't want any blood on their hands. So they're going to say, do the test, do the glucose screening, do the ultrasounds, do all this stuff. If you don't want to do it, just sign against medical advice and the liability is on you. So often it's a way to just make sure that their hands are clean. Some people really believe that getting as much information as possible through an ultrasound is going to help them have an easier experience later because they want that control. They want to know every single thing. They want to know how many inches the baby's grown, how many ounces it's gained, all that, and that helps them feel safe, right? And then there's people who, might say that it's all part of this psyop to degenerate and weaken the fetus and the baby, and this kind of general blanket of degeneration that this darker force is trying to accomplish. So there are many ways that we can look at this compulsion that we have for ultrasound wave technology. And I tell people, if you want to know the genetic composition of this baby and you really feel adverse to having a child with Down syndrome, then an ultrasound might be for you. Right? If that's the way you look at things, you don't want that responsibility. That's not something that you feel like you've signed up for. That's on you. But know why you're doing it. Don't just unconsciously show up at every ultrasound appointment because someone told you you're supposed to be there. What are the risks and benefits? What are you really trying to get from this? And know that there is a large margin of error for ultrasounds. They tell women their baby's weighing 10 pounds because of an ultrasound, and then the baby's born at 7.5 or 8 pounds. Okay, so you're not even getting fully accurate information. What do you really want from this? And why is your intuition not enough?
That was one of my questions for you too, which was, how do we get to the position where women are a lot more intuitive to a certain degree, just by nature of the feminine energy. And I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of different ways as to how they've kind of destroyed that. But I mean, what is it where we get to a point where women don't have the innate or the intuition behind their own body during pregnancy, and they have to sort of release that empowerment to someone else to be able to console them in some sort of way? And then you have the complications of what are the motives behind those people trying to console you in certain ways. But how do you think we got to the point where women don't have any idea about birth?
I mean, I think we all suffer from incredibly low self-worth. There's a deep deficit of self-love. And when we don't have that, we don't trust ourselves and we can't trust our intuition. Like we betray our bodies so much that we get to the point that even if like we're showing up at an appointment and like we start to feel nauseous, we start to have even cramping in the body starts talking and we're just ignoring it because we are so used to this self-betrayal. It's like knocking so loudly at the door and women will just ignore it and show up at the appointment, and their cervix is clenched, their whole body's clenched, they're feeling nauseous, lightheaded. And then they're like, oh, I'm going to take something for the nausea and the lightheadedness. I'm going to take something for this headache. And it's their body just screaming like, I don't want to be here and stop ignoring me. But I look at the way in which little girls and boys are raised. Like we're all raised to do that, right? We show up at a family function. I talk about this a lot, being born into a Latin family. And I talk about this a lot where it's like I'd go to family functions and my parents were like, oh, go kiss your uncle, go hug your aunt, go kiss your grandma. And I was like, I don't want to touch anyone. And I remember as a kid feeling like, ugh, but in order for me to be liked and accepted and like patted on the back, for being a good girl, I had to betray my body. And people are like, oh, that's so dramatic. Just kiss what's the big deal? My kids have to kiss their aunts and uncles. They're fine. I'm like, are they really fine? It's not like I had to undergo some deep physical trauma. It was like in small ways every day that built up over time. And then as an adult, I had to unlearn that. And so I see women going to these appointments, receiving vaginal exams that they don't want, receiving information and touch they don't want and they keep their mouth shut because they don't want their doctor, their midwife to disagree with them or dislike them. So we've been trained since childhood to go against our intuition and betray our body. And I wouldn't expect women to suddenly have that be different just because they become pregnant. I feel like it gets worse.
Yeah, and I feel like it's just chipping away from when you're young, like you said. I was talking recently that it's almost like they're getting rid of bullying in school and how to deal with bullies in school, because then they become the only bully in town and we have no idea how to deal with them. Right. It
Yeah.
just it's fascinating how these kind of things happen. And it just it is very, it's very interesting, again, being the opposite gender as the one that gives birth, that it's just it's so it's foreign to me, but then to have like it be foreign to women too is just it's very interesting that, you know.
Well, the other piece of that is that we hide birth from children. So historically, children were present at birth, right? Or all the little girls would be in the birth hut if they wanted to be. And so they would see birth as natural and normal. They would grow up watching breastfeeding happen. Women communally breastfed. So if one woman was away getting water and her baby was not on her back, strapped in a baby carrier, for some reason was with someone else and needed to eat, another woman who was producing milk would give baby milk. So that's how little girls grew up, understanding their worth and their purpose, right? One of their purposes, which is to become pregnant, birth, and breastfeed and nourish a child and continue the strength and the population of their tribe, which is very important. So we don't grow up doing that now. It's hidden because birth somehow became very sexualized, right? Because of this saturation in pornography and in this kind of like darker frequency of the erotic. Nudity has become very sexualized. Intercourse itself has become very sexualized rather than this is actually spiritual. This is about procreation. This is about continuing life. This is intentional. And so we hide procreation from children because it's like, no, that's adulterating. And they're like, oh, a stork dropped this baby off. Like, what? You know, like, yeah, mommy's pregnant. She leaves for 3 days. It comes back with this baby. And, you know, I don't know what to tell you. So the 3-year-old, the 4-year-old's like, I'm so confused, you know? And so the more we teach our children about normal, natural birth, pregnancy, you know, how a baby's created. Like, why can't we just be honest? Mommy has eggs, daddy has sperm. When they come together in love, a child is created. And one day when you find this right person, you can do this too, you know?
Right. Yeah, it reminds me also of tribal stuff too, where, you know, it wasn't a pornographic kind of frequency, but there was aspects of men and women teaching the young ones that, like, here's, you know, it's important to be able to perform these acts, and this is kind of how they're performed, as opposed to, you know, be able to kind of show those things not in a sexual way, but also in the sense of like, it's important to be able to pleasure and please your opposites, the opposite sex and stuff like that too, right? And it just, again, it's become the more darker energy version of those things that then in turn shun the light from all of these different things as well, where it's incredible how kind of how sick and twisted it's all gotten. But
Right. And if you want to teach your son or your daughter to be safe and protected in their adolescence before they go to marriage, teach them self-worth. You yourself have to have self-worth and embody that so that you can teach it to your children so that they don't go out and make decisions like, you know, whatever it is, like sleeping with every guy on the football team. You know, I don't know, whatever these things are that we're so scared of as parents. If your child has that self-worth, if they have family values, if they're connected to something greater than them, right? A benevolent universe, a God, then that's the way you protect them. You show them their worth. And then they wait, or they have more discernment, you know, but we just are like giving our kids cell phones, devices, leaving them at daycares, giving these other, you know, these daycares and these devices the power to raise our children. And then we wonder why our children have no concept of self-worth or direction or structure or stability. They're not even being raised by their own parents.
Yeah, and that's what's incredible about what's happening now with the schooling system and teaching all these insane things from a young age. And it's kind of like, how are the parents not like walking in there and being like, this is not, you go to school to figure out how to function in the world. That part of that part of this, you know, child rearing side of things is my responsibility. The idea that they're teaching these kids all these weird sexual shit now is just like, it's absolutely insane that people are allowing this to happen. I think it's because even what's happening in the pandemic side of things is like, people are like, look, if you're not going to use your brain, we're telling you everything. We're giving you full disclosure as to what we're doing. But if you're not going to use your brain, then we will take it and do what we want to do with it, because you're not going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people will say like, I don't have the time to homeschool or to spend time with my child because I need to pay the rent and buy food and I need to work. And I understand that, because we're choosing to participate in a society where that becomes the norm. Like, people have to survive. So the public school system or whatever system, that then becomes the source of who raises our children. And they're kind of like, well, I don't really like what they're doing there, but what, do I have a choice? I can't afford private school. I can't afford a tutor. They have to go there, and then, let's just hope for the best. Right. I mean, that's where we're at.
Yeah. And there's so many ways you can go down that. And this is the kind of plan of all these things. We were talking before we started here about the housing prices and stuff. And then if you're in insurmountable amounts of debt, then there's no possible way you can even think about not working so that you can pay to an outrageous amount of money to get like preschool and even those things. It's hilarious. Not hilarious, but a lot of women they're not at home with the kids to pay for because they can't afford to not work, but then they're working and their entire paycheck is going to getting their kids looked after while they're working.
And to formula. Right.
Right.
And to pay for formula because they're not at home breastfeeding because they have to work. So like, is it the chicken or the egg? Like, where does it begin? And so women will say, well, no, I am saving money by them being in daycare and giving them formula. And maybe they're walking away with like 15%. Maybe they're saving like 15%, but realistically, you have to be well above a certain amount of money that you're bringing in annually for it to actually be worthwhile and to get anywhere. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels.
Yeah. And what people are saying now too about if the brainwashing is effective with your kids, the idea of sending them off to a school of which you're going to pay an insane amount of money for them to get brainwashed. And then for the rest of their life, they're going to be down this path of thinking that, they're a unicorn and all that kind of stuff. Then it's unbelievably more expensive than it is to just be at home and raise your own kids and have that connection with them. And yeah, this is why I find your work so fascinating, and why I believe it's important, especially as a man, because, I was even going to say too, but it's our role to sort of protect in that kind of way. But at the same time, you have the female in other aspects of nature that have that protective side of things too, with like a mama bear. It's like, if you come after my kids, I'm going to rip your head off. And yet women go into these rooms, I've heard you talk about too, where they've even done your courses and things like that. And then they still end up getting, their kids with the jab and stuff like that, because the doctor just sort of tricks them into it, as opposed to saying like, listen to me, be very clear. Like, this is not going to happen. This is my child. And, we're not doing this. And it still is, the brainwashing is so intense. And I just think that it's to find even a woman that has that kind of raw power in her divine feminine, it's again, I guess, brainwashing the idea that that's not feminine, right? That's not a divine feminine to say, I'll rip your head off if you do anything to my kids.
I mean, it is. It's Kali, right? It's like the essence of this feminine power. That's like, I will do whatever it takes to retain my autonomy, and only someone who offers me guidance, safety, protection will allow me to disarm. So it's like the woman has to be in that. And yeah, I mean, so many people say, I'm doing a natural birth, I'm doing it at home, we're not doing any shots, but we're going to a pediatrician. And I'm like, oh, you still haven't fully accepted the intelligence of the body. So that's a whole other path of discovery.
What about the I guess, I don't know if the psyops is all the word of the day right now, but things like you were talking about C-sections. What about the head's too big, or there's other complications, or inducing, we have to get you out because you have this due date? Are those things all just arbitrary as well?
Totally. Totally. I mean, if we look at the way that gestational age and due dates were calculated previously, it was all based on women's cycles, and they're irregular, and every child is assimilating nourishment differently. And so every child is developing at a different rate. So there is no exact number of days that the child is supposed to be in the womb. So this thing about induction, I mean, it's Pitocin, which is synthetic oxytocin, which is what they typically use with inductions, or they use Cytotec, which is another drug. It's what makes the uterus contract and start to expulse the baby, expel the baby, I should say. And so it's become the most widely abused drug in obstetrics, because it's like, well, we can control the outcome. The woman's totally fine, not dilated, not contracting, not even anywhere near her due date. However, we can start to get the baby out this way. And if it doesn't work out, we'll just do a C-section. What's the big deal? So they give her information like, oh, the baby's head looks large. And I'm like, well, is it factual? Did you measure the skull? Is it physically incompatible with the outlet of the woman's pelvis, right? And we have to measure all of this through X-ray and ultrasound to really, really confirm this. But sometimes they'll just say, oh, this looks quite large. You know, you're a petite woman, and kind of looking at her from the outside and just saying, well, you know, your mother's petite, your husband's tall. We're just going to take all this information and prescribe an induction, right? And I'm like, no, get an actual factual diagnosis that there is a genetic disorder. Your baby has macrocephaly. The head is physically too big to exit through the pelvis. And now you're going to have a C-section. Okay. Like, but people don't do that. They just get one diagnosis and then they run with that. So I always encourage people to get, you know, second, third, fourth opinions, do your own research. Just takes a lot to do that research, because sometimes we find things that make us really uncomfortable. We find things that disrupt our current tapestry of belief and truth, and it's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable.
Reminds me so much of what's happening in the world right now, where everything is about quantitative analysis, when everything that is valuable in your life is qualitative. And it just, I don't know, it just fascinates me that there's so much correlation as to what you're doing right now too, that I was also curious about age, and if there's any, I mean, I know there's actual biological, I guess, data talking about quantitative, but what about age and birth and all that kind of stuff in your regard, and having a natural, you know, a natural birth?
Well, I think if the body was able to get pregnant, then the body's able to birth a baby. If your body wasn't able to get pregnant, then you can't birth a baby.
Simple, very simple answer. I love it. What about, I've heard you talk about you were talking about how the shots and stuff like that during pregnancy can have the complications of the baby, because there's some foreign object in them now, being like, what the hell is this fentanyl or whatever that I'm getting into my system now that slows the heartbeat down and all that kind of stuff. So with women who are apprehensive about the pain of childbirth, I've heard you talk about the, you know, moving into the purpose of that pain with childbirth, and that sort of I guess that initiation process. What is behind that, and why do you think that's important?
Well, so what's behind understanding the pain? We just have to first know that we have been heavily conditioned by what we've seen in Hollywood, right? In films and the stories we've heard. And that's really where we get our understanding of birth, right? These women's fear stories. And so I encourage people to look beyond that and to start to observe natural, normal physiological birth, watch birth videos, watch animals giving birth, starting to understand that it's a natural reaction of the body, right? Labor and birth are a symptom of pregnancy. So if you become pregnant, your body is naturally going to expel a baby when the baby is reached its maturity and final stage of development. That's just whether you want it to or not, whether you're sitting in a chair, whether you're at the beach, whether you're in a hospital, your body is going to do it. You can't control it. So understanding that it is a natural function of the body is the first place to begin in dispelling the fear. There's nothing you need to do. There is no special place you need to be in. There is no special conditions. There are no special conditions. So getting to that place is kind of like the baseline. And then unpacking the fears. What are the fears that I have around this? Oh, let me understand how nerves work, right? So every time a nerve in the pelvis is stimulated, every time I contract, more signals are sent to the brain to release more hormones, and that keeps the momentum of labor going. If I remove that, if I desensitize that, if I add drugs into the picture, I'm going to interrupt that process, and I'm actually going to put myself in a dangerous situation. So understanding that the quote, pain has a purpose is really important. And then understanding further that this is not a pain like you've sustained an injury, you've broken a bone, you've gone into a car accident and split your head open. This is intense, but this is simply the body going through a physical process. This is not an injury, and it will end. There is an end to it. There's an expiration date. With an injury, we don't know how long we're going to be in discomfort, right? So that we have to start to separate the two. We have this idea that birth and labor are kind of like an injury, something that's happening to the body from the outside, the boogeyman again. So when we start to understand it's just coming from within, the body is just simply reacting. No matter where you are, no matter what you do, the body's going to do this. And so just surrender to it and know that it's not going to kill you. The pain is not ever going to be bigger than you because your body is creating it on its own. So I think that's where we have to begin from. And, you know, having supportive people around. There are so many family members that people have that are like unconsciously spewing really venomous information to pregnant women that's lodging them further into a fear matrix. Like, oh, you're going to want to have that epidural. When I had my baby, I couldn't have done it without the epidural. And then you're like, oh, well, did you have a pleasant experience? No, it was horrible. Well, I thought that you got the epidural, so I thought it was great, but now you're saying it was still horrible even though you got the epidural. It's like, you just have to be very discerning in the information that you're taking in and digesting and who's around you, and start to cut cords, start to draw boundaries, and start to make conscious decisions about your environment.
So with that, I think we hit on this a bit, but what are there rare major problems with home births? And like, if someone was truly needed that help or intervention, like, is it way less than what is said in those kind of, yeah.
Totally. I mean, there's even a movie, I didn't watch it because I don't, if I don't want to be in a field of any kind, then I just don't expose myself to the information. But I know, like in passing, I saw that Shia LaBeouf recently did a film about home birth, like home birth gone wrong. And then there's like clips of the midwife in a courtroom. And it's like, it's all programming. It's all programming to lodge women further into a codependent dynamic with our conventional medical system. So if you don't want to continue to participate in that fear matrix, stop exposing yourself to things that will keep you in the fear matrix. Like, choose to expose yourself to things that are going to liberate you, to emancipate you. You know, and we look at severe emergencies. Yeah. I mean, a woman after, you know, in a home birth, after her baby's born, could hemorrhage. Okay. So then the midwife takes out her injection of Pitocin and will inject her leg with Pitocin until the uterus contracts and the hemorrhaging stops. Okay. So like, that's a situation that could be serious, but that happens in the hospital as well. And it typically happens more often with women who've been given Pitocin during their labor, who then end up hemorrhaging after the birth and then are given Pitocin again. So it's quite rare. The thing about home birth is that if a woman is high risk in her pregnancy, she's not going to be able to home birth. A midwife will not take her into her care. I have a client right now who was planning for a home birth, and she's gaining weight very rapidly in her pregnancy. And the midwife said to her, if you don't stop gaining so much weight so quickly, I'm going to transfer you to OB care because you'll be high risk. So midwives don't even take on situations that could potentially present a problem down the line. So already there, you're eliminating potential for things going haywire. You know, they're seeing red flags coming way down the line. So we just have to be more educated about how prenatal care works with midwives. People assume that if you're working with a midwife, you're like going rogue and working with a witch in some hut somewhere. And that's not how it is. You know, these are very educated women and men. I recently met a male midwife here in Miami, and they're very educated individuals who actually learn about birth through observing natural childbirth. Whereas an OB, I mean, I have colleagues who are OBs. I have a friend who works at Columbia Hospital in New York, and she told me, I didn't witness a natural birth until like 6 years into my practice. She's like, in med school, I learned about birth from women who were on epidurals. So she's like, I never learned about what an unmedicated birth looked like. I didn't realize labor could be so long and normal and natural. So remember, your OBs are not even learning on unmedicated women. They're learning on women who are medicated, and that is not a clear picture of birth. Yep. So midwives in general have way more knowledge about natural, normal physiological birth. And if there's any indication that you are going to risk high, they won't even take you. So don't worry about some high risk thing happening at home, because it's less likely. Not to say that rare occurrences don't happen, but just know they're not as common as we think.
Yeah, so kind of if you're cleared for it, just you're kind of good to go. You wouldn't be cleared for it unless you're able to, and if you are cleared, then we're good to go.
Yeah.
But you were saying about the one that was having a bit of complications because of her gaining weight too fast. One of the things that I've dove into, and I've studied with Paul Chek and his work, and the idea of primal eating and the Weston A. Price diet and nutrition and physical degeneration. And one of the fascinating stories in that book was there was a pregnant woman who just basically just walked into the bush, had a kid, walked back out with it in her arms, and he was just like, oh my God. So how important is that with someone who could potentially not be cleared from this, from gaining weight too quickly? How important is diet and nourishment during, before, and after pregnancy, and those sort of more primal diets that I find is probably the Weston Price one is like the most complete and I guess natural one, because it was just solidified by his findings in nature. But just wondering your opinion on those kind of things.
Yeah, diet is paramount. I mean, nutrition is paramount, and it's a steep learning curve for someone who has been eating a certain way and then becomes pregnant, and now they have to shift so much to actually support their pregnancy, and a lot of emotions get kicked up because a lot of us are emotionally attached to ways of eating and taking in food and beverages. And so we have to make these shifts, and it can be really challenging for some people. And I really commend my students who actually say, you know what, I'm going to do whatever it takes. Like, I'm going to stop with the veganism. I'm going to adopt, organ meats, animal fats. I'm going to stop pretending that coconut oil and avocado oil is going to give me what I need. And I'm going to really go there. And I see huge shifts happen in their pregnancies, in their overall health, and and if you want to go back to being plant-based after you're done breastfeeding and that feels like socially, emotionally, and physically correct for you, then do that. But know that when you become pregnant, you're now needing to sustain a biological system and a life. And this other type of diet is not how we ate. This is not an ancestral diet. This is not the type of diet that got us to where we are now after millennia. If women had been eating like this, I doubt we would be here if we had all been plant-based for millennia, because the degeneration over time would have occurred. So, it's not to say that diet doesn't work, but seasonally, we have to think seasonally. We have to eat seasonally, and that means seasons in life as well, right? Like, I was raw vegan for almost 2 years in college. I had no stress. I had nothing going on for that very specific period of time. And eating that way really worked for me. And I look back on it as a time that my body actually detoxed a lot. And that's what it was. Right. And then 8 years later, I tried it again and I got really sick. I was not well, and so I started eating intuitively. And it was in my pregnancy that I started noticing, oh, this is what my body needs. I'm craving organ meat. Okay, I'm going to try it, And so I really encourage people to release the rigidity around diet and nourishment, and to open their minds and their bodies to the possibility that they don't know everything. And we should look at history, and we should look at the humans before us. How did they nourish themselves, and what worked? There were no dental issues back then. What does that say about the way that they were eating? Mm-hmm. Let's look at these really active hunter-gatherer communities, zero cardiovascular issues. Look at the way that they're eating and look at the amount of movement they're doing. Even when they're resting, they're actually being active because they're squatting. So this is a passive activity. They're actively resting, I should say. They're doing things that are improving circulation, supporting circulation, right? They're not sitting in a chair slumped over for 10 hours a day. When they rest, they squat or they tailor sit. And they rest 10 hours a day, but they're in a squat or they're in a tailor pose. So it's not impossible, but it's a matter of being open-minded and reframing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have Yeah, even the dietary stuff is intense, and the veganism stuff is huge too. And I understand it from a certain level of animal cruelty and whatnot. But even the Alpha Vedic guys that interviewed you and Berlindo talked about how you can not eat flesh foods and still get these nourishing things, but they make that
Right.
very difficult too with raw milk and all that kind of stuff. Like it's illegal here in Canada. Like it's a class like A narcotic. Like it's worse than heroin. The RCMP will like raid your friggin' um your farm if you're doing anything with raw milk, and it just so there's ways around it, but yeah, there's a lot of
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be flesh eating if that is completely not resonant for you, but there are ways to get the vitamin A, D, and K that you need and the fetus needs through colostrum, raw butter, kefir, eggs. I mean, you need the choline. You can spend a lot more time in the sun to get the vitamin D that we need. So there are a lot of ways to do that that don't require flesh eating. And this isn't just about being plant-based. I mean, I look at people who are highly or consuming processed foods and are on a high processed foods diet, and they think, like consuming meats that are really processed, or consuming Beyond Burgers, or consuming a lot of soy, like a lot of things that are just so highly processed that because they're like obsessed with the organic label when they see like non-GMO organic, and so they automatically assume that this is nourishing, and that's all the greenwashing that's happening. So it's like there's so many layers to this, and it's like, well, can you produce your own food? If you can't, can you access the CSA, community supported agriculture? Is there anywhere in your state or in your region where there are farmers producing animal products? Can you access that? I mean, like there are so many ways to go, and I think it's just a matter again of being willing to look at something that otherwise would have made you uncomfortable before, and just opening your mind to it.
Yeah, it makes me think too that the idea with Crowded Teeth and how Weston Price and his work noticed that they had all these perfect bone structures and all that kind of stuff, and it's almost like they feed us the stuff to degenerate us, and then they go, oh, see how you don't have your wisdom teeth anymore, and see how your pinky toe isn't really like doing anything anymore? That's evolution. You know what I mean? It's just sort of like, no, it's you guys messing around with us how we're supposed to be. And kind of going off of that, with your work, how important do you think is the development of the actual individual to have the sort of the soul coming into the body, into beinghood, not having this crazy intense experience of fluorescent lights and doctors and the mother on anesthetics and stuff like that? How, do you how important do you think that is for the soul coming into the being, for the development to live in this kind of this plane that we're on right now? How do you conceptualize that at all in your work?
Yeah. So I really believe that we contractually, like we contractually choose how we're going to come in. So even if the child, the spirit, the soul has chosen to come in through a violent birth, through a C-section in that setting, that is part of their contract. And that is part of what they need in this 3D experience, in this human experience, to then overcome and either purify the soul, move through an expansion. That is part of what they're doing, part of the work that they're doing here on this earth. So yeah, I would like to say that birthing without the fluorescent lights, without the high stress, high cortisol, high adrenaline levels in the mother, that's ideal. It's gentle, it's beautiful. And I think more women can work toward creating that environment for themselves and for their family. However, I would never look back on a traumatic birth and say that shouldn't have happened, because I really believe that all of this is laid out. It's a tapestry that's laid out for our expansion. And I'm not one to question that soul's relationship with God and with what they've chosen to come into. And people say, oh, that's such, that's your white privilege talking. I've heard that so many times, and that's fine. You can believe, you can believe whatever you want about me. However, I know that the really challenging situations in my life that I have chosen, that I have co-created with God, have assisted so deeply in my expansion. I would not be doing the work that I do today, helping women, had I not sustained some pretty severe traumatic situations regarding my body, and that's how I look at it. What am I going to sit in victimhood and wish that it had never happened? No, the gift, you spin that shit into gold, and that's the bottom line. So I really think it's a matter of living in gratitude for everything. Right? If we look at the prophet Jonah in the Quran, he was swallowed by a whale. And he was in the whale's belly and he's like, why is this happening to me? I've been such a good person. Why am I going to die here? And then he was spit out on this shore that was full of amazing riches. And then he was able to teach about his story. And so he lived in gratitude, knowing that this really dark experience that was near death brought him to this beautiful place of then being able to help many, many people and to experience a lot of gifts that's a lot presented him with, right? So that's how we have to look at this. And I work with a lot of women who have birth trauma, from their own birth, and then when they birth their own babies, and they say, I can't let go of this. I'm living in this cycle. So we break down the experience that they had. We follow the steps of how they arrived at that C-section or whatever it was, and then we give thanks, right? We express gratitude for now you have this awareness about medical freedom because of your traumatic experience. Now you're an advocate for the health freedom movement simply because you experienced that trauma. And now your voice is helping many people. You might not have arrived at being a freedom advocate had you not gone through this really intense process with your baby. So we always have to look at it with gratitude.
Right. Yeah. And I've talked about it a couple of times on here. A friend of the show, Tom Barnett, talks about, not taking the bottle out of the drunk's hand, because they have to hit bottom on their own. And any of these experiences that you have is that opportunity to do that and then shed a light and pass the torch and a helping hand to kind of go forward. Right. Heroin addicts that are now super into health and they're helping other addicts get off that, it's kind of that whole sort of superpower thing, right? Which is just using your trauma as a way to help others.
And who are we to question that soul's choice of what expansion looks like to them? Expansion comes from these really challenging situations. So who am I to question? Right. But I would say that, yes, it would be beautiful if all babies could be born in these ideal settings and the couples felt like they had freedom and liberty and, this choice and this curation of this beautiful process. However, if it doesn't happen that way, we find the gift in the other way that it happened. What other choice do you have?
Exactly. And I think that's why they're playing on the victimhood so much of not being able to transmute that into the, use that sort of alchemy to become more realized in this world, and to just stew on the victimhood and blame it on someone else. Cause then you never perform that. Right. And with the idea that there is that contract when you come in here, I've heard you talk about helping women go through the process of connecting to the consciousness of the being that they're bringing into the world. And I was wondering what are those tools that you provide to women during their pregnancy to sort of have the communication and without the ultrasounds, connect with your own body, with your own baby that's living inside of you, as opposed to shifting that empowerment off to someone else.
Yeah, there's a few things women can do. They can purchase a stethoscope, they can listen to the baby, they can connect through the heartbeat, they can talk to the baby, they can ask the baby questions, and this comes down to fine-tuning and trusting your intuition. I'll say to them, ask a question, and whatever the first thing is that you hear, trust that that's the answer. Trust that that's like the call and response that you have with the baby. And some women can really open themselves up to this possibility. And some women have a more challenging time believing this to be true because they don't trust that they have the power to hear what their baby's saying, So that's one way to do it. Tracking movement, feeling the movement, putting music near the baby, near the belly, and noticing the baby move, finding ways to interact, telling the baby stories. Those are all beautiful ways to do that. And really, it's just an invitation. Like maybe there hasn't been a person in this woman's life who has said, your body better than anyone else. Only you are going to know this baby better than anyone else. And they're like, oh, wow. It's just an invitation to notice what's already there.
There's so much power in that too, with people not even, I guess, not realizing their potential too, right? And just having someone acknowledge it, saying, no, you can do this. It's that whole running the 4-minute mile or whatever it is, no one could do it. It was impossible. And then one person did it, and then 3 people did it, and now it's the norm, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, when you don't know what you're capable of, you don't think that you're capable of anything, right? And yeah. one thing I've been dying to ask you too, but I wanted to kind of to sort of dive into a couple other things before we got into that, because I
Yeah.
first heard about Goda from you on the podcast with Alpha Vedic, and since I've had Ricky Stanzi on the show here, mentioned to
Nice.
him that I met that I found out about those guys from you, and because this is such a physical event, right? There's the pain involved. It's an event. It's sort of, could be a marathon in some ways. How important is that physical event, and how important is training for that event with adequate exercise? And then why did you get gravitated toward Goda, and how would you implement that into someone's plan?
Okay.
It might be a lot there.
So I learned about Goda through a friend of mine, Hamad Shirazi, who's a physical therapist, and he had been doing it. And I was like, wow, I tried out a session with one of his coaches, and I was like, my body feels good. Like this feels right for my body. Like I'd had this knee pain going and going. So I wasn't able to jog anymore. I had been a gymnast. I played basketball and volleyball my whole life. And, in the last like 5 years, I had developed this knee pain and I just couldn't run anymore. And so I did this one session, and he said to me, the coach was like, you have been walking like this, he's like, I would suggest that you consider doing this barefoot. And he just gave me some tweaks that I then tried out at home. And I started noticing that there was less pain in my knee. It was still there, but I was like, oh, I'm a believer, you know? And then I contacted Ricky Stanzi, and we did a session and an assessment through the app. And, where he had me draw dots on my knees and all these points in my legs. And then he watched me walk in slow motion. And then he told me where I was bearing weight, where I wasn't bearing weight, and so through that, I had this new body awareness. I started noticing, how I'm sitting, how I'm standing, how often I'm walking, how often I'm sedentary. And I couldn't unsee what I had seen. And so I started incorporating this into what I was teaching my students. I had already been teaching them about squatting. I mean, the resting squat is something that I've been teaching for the last 8 years. That wasn't really groundbreaking for me. What was groundbreaking was the standing resting posture and noticing where the pelvis is when we're standing. Right. And then also noticing where we're placing weight on our feet and really using the big toes as kickstands and starting to just understand those nuances. And so I started incorporating that. And then the head of Goda, which is Coach Gill, he invited me to do the podcast with him and Bam. And, from there, we built that relationship and that connection. And Coach Gill is always saying, you're a Goda coach, you're already teaching this, like you're bringing people back to their natural state. And so that's where I built that relationship and that love for that type of movement, and then, formed my own little process with it. And so I always refer my clients out to their coaches. And I say, if you want to go deeper, work with them. And, I know Goda is really focused toward athletes. And, Bam is really one of the coaches who's brought Goda to like the lay person, I would say. Like he's made it accessible to, this primal movement accessible to the everyday woman. Most of my friends have now worked with Bam, they're ballet dancers, and they're like, oh, I've been doing this WOTA movement my whole life, and I have all these injuries, and my hips are turned in and they're compressed this way. And like, now they're like opening up to this whole new world and finding strength in their upper body. Whereas before it was all about their lower body. And now they're noticing the connection between all parts. And so Goda can be very emotionally liberating as well, as we start to unlock parts of our body that have been pretty dormant for quite some time.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, I love Bam. I've got Ricky on. I want to get Bam on here because he's, like you said, he's fantastic with showing these things and being, in the new age kind of making things go viral and stuff like that. He's fantastic. But through learning that, researching that, I got to thank you, because now my feet have been sore for like 6 months because I've been walking newly and all that kind of stuff. But now I'm like looking at my brother has 3 young ones, and I can just see in them. I haven't like slowed the, filmed them and slow mode it and all that kind of stuff. But you just see, the chest is out, the barrel's hanging out, they got this big old belly, but their pelvis is behind. You just look at it and you go, holy crap. And that's why as soon as I heard about it, I researched it. And then I saw them working with, Vortex mathematics and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, this is legit. And then I see it in my brother's kids immediately. And I go, man, this is pretty incredible. And
Totally.
even with like playing with kids too, right? Like the idea that, now we have to go to the gym and all this kind of stuff, but it's like life is our playground and life is our gym, and
That's what I tell my clients. I'm like, my students, there is no special pregnancy workout that I recommend. They're like, is there a pregnancy Pilates class? I'm like, no.
yeah.
You simply have to move differently through the world, and you will get to a place where you're pain-free and you're active, right? You're burning the calories, you're getting the movement, you're toning the muscles, like the glutes are getting stronger. Women, there are no reports anthropologically of women enduring pregnancy pains and aches and pains, right? Because they were eating nourishing diets, high in the high mineral content, and they were moving. They were squatting every day. They were, whatever it was, picking crops, collecting water, carrying other babies, bearing weight on their head with baskets. So it's like when you bear that weight on your head, if it's a basket or something, you actually have to put the pelvis behind you and stick the barrel forward in order to have that compensate properly, and so women don't do that now. They're working at desks all day, many of my clients, and then they'll do their 30-minute walk and they'll do a little bit of go to movement. They're like, I'm not quite there yet. I'm still feeling this. And I'm like, you have to like sit at that computer for 10 minutes and that's it. And then you have to get up and move and then you go back. You cannot be in this extended seating position because that's going to compress your lower spine. It's going to close the pelvis. You're decoding yourself every time you sit this way. So can you change your desk? Can you stand and then do like the Michael Jordan and cross the legs over? Can you squat? Can you tailor sit? Like, what are all the ways in which you can adapt to this work life with these indigenous primal movements, let's say? And so it takes a commitment. But all of this pregnancy pain, discomfort, that whole industry has so much to do with the poor posture and poor movement. The shoes women are wearing, they're wearing these like little torture chambers on their feet, Nikes, Adidas, Vans. Women are still wearing heels, like all those things. And so it's a matter of changing our shoes and walking on grass, walking on soft surfaces.
Right. And even playing with your kids too, and using that as like a playground and an exercise as well. And I heard you talk about strollers and bouncy castles or jolly jumpers or whatever they're called. Right. And so, so what's your opinion on that? And then what's your alternative? Is it just being a more like jacked parent, just being stronger?
Yeah. I mean, if we watch children before they become decoded, they become decoded when we put them in school because then they have to sit at desks, right? And you're always saying, sit up straight, right? Your kid sits at the table, sit up straight. Don't sit on the counter. Don't stand up. And so it's like they start to become these little robots where they're sitting perfectly in a chair with their, spine straight like this, and they're, not moving. And we start to decode them. So if we observe them beforehand, right, we see when they want to play with something on the ground, they squat. Okay, so we squat with them. We play with them that way. We don't sit at a table to do activities. We do it on the floor. A lot of people have their kids in those little jumpers where it's like a swing where they put the legs in and then the kids in this kind of like jumping thing with the table. And people say, oh, this is how kids develop strength in their legs and muscles, and this is how they learn to walk. And I'm like, no, this is not how they learn to walk. How they learn to walk is by first learning to roll over, and then they start army crawling on their forearms. And as they start to army crawl, they'll start to pick up that back leg, and then they start to do this kind of lizard crawl. They go kind of up higher into a cheetah crawl, and then they start to grab on surfaces and pull themselves up. And they're like, oh, I can pull myself up. I can get higher. And then once they get higher, they'll completely pick themselves up and they'll stand on their feet, and then they'll, fall backwards and say, oh, I accomplished something new. That's my goal for tomorrow. When it's playtime, I'm going to like get up there again. And then that's how they figure it out. It comes very organically. We don't have to put them in special contraptions to teach them how to do anything. I mean, those things did not exist before. And we look at these indigenous men, they were ripped. And all they were doing was like walking around, hunting, climbing trees. The women were ripped as well. They were birthing easily. They were not having complications because they were in these movements all the time. And so, yeah, these harnesses, these playpens, I call them cages, all of these contraptions, those are all ways of slowing down your child's development. And also creating fear, right? Oh, I don't want my child getting into anything. I don't want my child falling or rolling over and hitting its head. So I'm just going to keep it in this, kind of like veal. It's like they stay in these cages and then they're like they never develop any muscle tone. They never develop coordination because they're kept like that for so long. And so I would say, set your entire house up so that it's proofed, meaning, you cover the outlets, you don't have pointed corners, and there is nothing that your baby can grab onto and topple over, right? Are you willing to commit to that? If you are, and don't wear shoes in the house, right? So that the floor is clean, let's say. If you're willing to commit to that, your child is going to have an entire playground. It's going to watch you walk around your own house. It's going to follow you. It's going to get interested in crawling. It's going to get interested in movement. You don't have to do anything special. Your child's just going to learn by watching you. We did this with our daughter, and she started walking at 10 months, which for me was like insane, because all I had ever known were, children walking after they turned 1. And it was exciting because once she started walking, I was like, all right, you're ready to potty train, and I know people potty train even sooner than that with elimination communication, but I was like, this is happening pretty organically. So now she could follow me to the toilet. She could watch me there. She started figuring it out. They learned so fast. And she was out of diapers within, a few months after that.
Yeah,
and then go ahead.
Well, no, I've heard you talk about that, about even diaper training and having cloth diapers as opposed to these, for first of all, like chemical baths almost, but also the sort of neurological connection between, if you want to pee, they pee, then they're wet and cold, and then they don't like that sensation, and they can learn that they can do something in a different way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, they get that sensation like, oh, my bladder's stimulated, it's full. And then they pee themselves and they say, oh, that's what happens. So my bladder gets stimulated. I feel a sensation. I release. I get cold. It's uncomfortable. Next time, I'm going to prevent it, right? I'm going to call out to my mom when I feel the sensation to pee, and maybe she can get me to the toilet before I pee myself. And they start to make these connections on their own. When they're in a disposable diaper, they can pee 3, 4, 5 times before they really notice they're uncomfortable. And then there's no real connection being built between sensation to pee, peeing, and being uncomfortable, because so much time has lapsed between the 3. So yeah, disposable diapers also hinder development, but people find them to be convenient, and they don't know that there are other options.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like all the ways of which to make them independent are the things of which they tell you is making them dependent, even with, I've heard you talk about sleeping with your newborns too, right? And they would think like, oh, well, that's going to make them way too dependent, and they're always going to want to sleep with them and stuff like that. And, I've heard you say that, well, no, they can become autonomous and they can become independent when saying like, I choose to not sleep here anymore. I want to sleep on my own. And that gives them that empowerment too, right?
Yeah. I mean, they build that healthy attachment, right? Where they feel secure and they know that you're going to be there no matter what. When we start to push our child away to, quote, make them independent, that child feels rejected. And that child also feels like, is my mom going to be there when I turn around, right? We can look at the work of Dr. Edward Tronick, where there's different types of attachment. There's healthy attachment, there's anxious attachment, and then there's avoidant attachment. Right. And so when we are always putting our kid in a situation where like we're dropping them off at a daycare or with other caregivers really early on, you're their touchstone in this world. You're their mother. And so when they see you going away and they're crying for you, they don't know when you're going to come back. For them, 10 minutes feels like 1 hour. 6 hours feels like an eternity, and it's very uncertain for them. It does not build stability. And so when we offer we offer them that attachment, that consistency, that predictability, they become more apt to take chances, to become independent on their own. And they'll say, I want to walk towards that tree over there that's pretty far away, but I know that when I turn around, she's still going to be there because she's never left me before. I always know that when I turn around, she's there. Then they start taking chances on their own. We don't have to push them and be like, go, just come on, like take the chance. And then the child's like, fuck, I don't feel ready, And, we just have this idea that children become overly attached, that they should be doing things on their own, that they're these little adults, that they, by age 3 should be well adjusted at a preschool and not cry for us. And they should sleep on their own. They should be eating on their own. And it's really sad, and there's a whole industry that makes money off of training children. And if we look at all of this, it's all really for the convenience of the parent. The disposable diaper, it's for the convenience of the parent. I don't have to change this diaper so often. Look at the bottle, it's for the convenience of the parent. Oh, I don't have to be tethered to this child all day, breastfeeding, oh, we look at the daycare, it's for the convenience of the parent. Sleep training, convenience of the parent. Oh, I don't have to be tired. The child's going to sleep in its own crib. I don't have to deal with it. And then we're spun this whole story that it makes the child more independent. I don't necessarily find that to be true. And I'm around a lot of kids. I have a 6-year-old. So I see all kinds of parenting styles and practices. And then I see the outcome in the children. I'm like, all right.
Yeah. And it really just goes to the idea that we can see the problems that are happening in today's society, and something either needs to change or whatnot. And the idea of going back to natural systems and natural ways of doing things seems like obviously the most obvious answer here. And it's wild that it's so insulated and protected, and the insurance companies and all these different things that are preventing people to step into that power within that. And yeah, it's incredible. And I really, like I said, I was very fascinated to jump into this conversation, and to because it's just so fascinating and different as a man to kind of dive into this stuff. But it's so relatable to the world that we're living in and what we're seeing around us happen. And going back to nature, I think is everyone's kind of birthright. All right, I mean, yeah. So essentially, this is all very empowering in regards to what I was originally talking about at the beginning of this, about why is a man interested in this, especially one that doesn't have kids on the way and all this kind of stuff. And I find this just so fascinating that there's so many correlations between what we're seeing and happening in the world right now, and just moving back to nature in general. The only really thing that I had left for you was, I find this absolutely fascinating. I have no idea about it, but the more that people talk about it, I find it just fascinating, weird that there's this kind of dark side of this sort of stuff. So I was wondering, what is the role of the placenta? What is up with all this weird placenta shit that's happening at birth, like selling it and whatnot? I'm just looking at my notes here. Like I have like, what's up with this weird placenta shit, selling it and whatnot? What the fuck? Just like what is going on with that? Like, why is that? So if you can enlighten me as to the ideas of ingesting the placenta, why is that important? What is going on with selling it and stuff like that? Can you dive into this?
Yeah, sure. So the placenta is a disposable organ that the mother creates in her body, made from the sperm of the father and the egg of the mother, just like the baby. And the placenta, people think it's like a filter, right? And so they're like, oh, it's dirty, it's filtering everything out. That's not really how it works. It does recognize pathogenic material, and it will block it from reaching the baby. Certain viruses, bacterial infections, things like that. If we look at things that way. However, it doesn't block things out like heroin or Tylenol or alcohol, right? Because the body itself doesn't recognize those things as pathogens. They're man-made. And so the placenta serves a really great function. It's what sustains the baby's life. It's filled with stem cells, it's filled with iron, it's packed with all of the hormones that the mother's producing throughout the pregnancy. And so postpartum, she has the option to keep the placenta and have it prepared, either turned into a broth. She can cut it up and consume it raw. She can fry it with onions and eat it like they do in some countries. She could turn it into a tincture, right? She could soak it in grain alcohol for 6 weeks, and then she can, take it as a tincture that way. She can dehydrate it, pulverize it, and take it as capsules. So there are a lot of ways in which the mother can ingest it postpartum. Mammals in nature will typically consume their placenta for 2 reasons: to cover up their tracks of the birth so that predators don't notice that a woman has just given birth, or a female has given birth and has a vulnerable baby, that's available as a meal, right, to that predator. So it's a way of covering up her tracks. It's also a way of replenishing her nourishment. If she doesn't have a male counterpart that's going to go out and bring food to her and the baby while she's resting postpartum just after the birth and recovering, she has the placenta as a meal to give her that nourishment. So I encourage women to take their placenta. There are some religious practices which prevent or forbid women from consuming it. So what they'll do is they'll plant it in the earth, they'll pray over it. They acknowledge it as the sustaining force for the baby, right? It's what sustained the baby's life these 10 months in the womb. And so there is just generally a reverence for it throughout many cultures. And what's happening here is that we look at these stem cell therapy companies, not only in the United States, Israel, Europe, Canada, most likely. And they're using what's called birth waste, the amniotic sac, the placenta, the umbilical cord, and they're harvesting the stem cells from this tissue, and they're turning it into therapies that cost thousands and thousands of dollars that athletes use, that people use, pre-surgery. There is a doctor out in Colorado who injects stem cells before they do, hip surgeries, for example. And so they're finding a lot of value in these stem cell therapies. And, I don't think it's fully approved by the FDA. However, if they're not getting it from humans, they're getting it from sheep, they're getting it from bovine sources. But really, it's ideal to get it from a human. It's compatible for us, right? So I just encourage people to look more deeply into that. I've had nurses write to me on Instagram and say, I used to work in labor and delivery, and I saw with my own eyes that the placenta was discarded into the trash. I'm like, okay, that might be the case. However, I've also spoken to labor and delivery nurses who are like, oh yeah, we package that up and it's stored. And I'm not sure why it's stored and then where it goes after, but I just know that we're instructed to store it. Right. And so, it's not that there's something consciously insidious about this process. A lot of people who work in hospitals have taken an oath, and they believe that they're doing everything they can to help and assist the health and the safety of the woman. They don't know that they are a cog in this greater mandala that is pretty satanic and dark. So I would just encourage everyone to do their research. If you don't know what you want to do with your placenta, then take it home and freeze it and figure it out later, or donate it to a woman that teaches placenta encapsulation. Or if it feels really right for you that it's being used for stem cell therapy medication, then let the hospital keep it or donate it that way. But just be conscious of what's happening with it. It is not trash.
Yeah, I think I forget what I saw it on. It might have been some weird reality TV thing. Like the end of it was like some outtake, and it was some doctor who said that. Oh, or no, he was some sort of sales consultant, and he was saying, oh yeah, those. She was like, oh, what do you do? And he goes, well, might sound a bit weird, but yeah, these, like placenta. He's like, yeah, I sell those for about like $30,000 a pop or something like that. She's like, what? And it's just this weird thing, and it was just sort of like weird that there was the revelation of the method in that kind of regard. But then, yeah, I don't know. Again, as a guy having no sort of background in any of this kind of stuff, just hearing about that kind of side of things, I'm like, what the hell is going on here? But yeah, I was just curious as to why it's important for when you're talking about women ingesting it. Like, what are the benefits? Is it essentially just the idea of like getting the nutrients back into the baby? Like they ingest it with the breast milk, and then
so the woman takes it like a multivitamin basically after the birth, and she's getting a dose of hormones that her body produced during the pregnancy, which her body has stopped producing. So as soon as the baby's out, her body stops producing this set of hormones. So through taking these capsules, it's almost like she's weaning herself off of that hormone production. They're also really high in iron. The placenta is very high in iron. So she's getting iron, right? Which tends to become pretty low when we're breastfeeding, typically because our diets are deficient. And then she's also getting stem cells, which, as we know, help regenerate tissue in this healing process. A lot of the women that have asked me to encapsulate their placenta, because I also train women how to encapsulate placentas and prepare placentas. So I train doulas as well. I'm really all about like spreading this philosophy, into birth work. And so a lot of the women that do a placenta encapsulation for their second birth and maybe didn't do it for their first, write to me personally and say, I am noticing a significant difference in my mood, in my energy level, and in my milk. Like my milk came in the day I started taking the capsules, because breast milk doesn't typically come in for like 3 to 5 days until after the birth. Women produce colostrum, which is a yellow kind of gold liquid that's packed with antibodies and basically the bacteria and all the substance that the baby needs to begin establishing its gut and sustaining life outside of the womb. And so women's milk doesn't typically come in, like the white milk doesn't come in for 3 to 5, maybe 6 days. And so women say, when I took the placenta capsules, my milk was in a few hours later and it was flowing and I feel really good. I have a lot of energy. So I'd like to hear that. And people will write and say, like, where are the studies? What's the evidence that this is even safe, that this is good for you? And I'm like, let's look at who creates studies. If there's an industry that's benefiting off of something being a certain way, they're going to fund the studies. There is no industry right now, except for mine, that's benefiting off of women taking their placenta capsules. And I don't have the money to fund a study. So I'm not, I don't have anything for you, but what I do have is anecdotal evidence, so if that'll suffice, then you can run with that. And if not, if you need, PubMed to tell you that something is okay to do or not to do, if you need the CDC to tell you it's good or bad, then I can't help you. But just know that it's a superfood. It's packed with nutrition and it's going to assist you. And if it doesn't do anything for you, well, at least you tried. Some women will say, I took it and I didn't really feel very much. And I'm like, well, at least you didn't feel depleted. At least you didn't feel depressed and low energy. So it might have done something.
Yeah, it's most things with health too, right? It's very nominal in terms of people. It's not like a drug that would definitely make you feel something. It's like
right.
Closer to sort of what you should naturally feel, which is just like general ease and
equilibrium.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I know. It's like, I don't feel high. Is this working?
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. It's crazy. But again, it's all going back to nature, and it's all sort of doing things naturally as we used to. And I just wonder, just to sort of close this up, I usually kind of ask these questions, and I think we've hit on a lot of different things here, but for women or couples who want to find strength, courage, resiliency, and empowerment in some sort of way to either just in general, operate in this world that we're living in, or B, in actually going through with something like you provide with natural birthing and stuff like that, what would you say to them who think that they might need another extra kind of kick as to this is right for them and they can do this?
Well, you don't know what you don't know. So I would say just start looking at what you want to create. When we get really clear on what we would like our lives to look like and what we want to create in partnership, or, even if you're an individual who's not in partnership, what do you want that partnership to look like? And if you want there to be consciousness in that dynamic and you want to have this like conscious co-creation, then you can start understanding this process now. Start understanding what your fears are about this process. And it's really look at it as a liberation and as an emancipation from old patterning and old ways of thinking, and if you don't even want to have children, you're not interested in partnership, or you want a partner, but you don't want a family, like this is also a way for both of you in your partnership to emancipate yourselves, get deeper into your truth together. A lot of couples that go through this education process about birth and the work we do together, like their relationship will actually strengthen because they realize they haven't really been communicating openly about these desires and preferences. This is an opportunity to do that and to heal. So really, this is just about healing ultimately, dispelling myths and getting closer to our truth.
I love it. I couldn't agree more. And I think it's so important with what's happening in the world right now. And it's just another little piece to take back sovereignty, to take back your health in general,
Yeah.
and heal, like we talked about at the beginning of this, heal sort of potentially generational wounds too, and then move into the world that we want to live in.
Yeah.
Well, if people want to get a hold of you, if they found this interesting, they want to learn more, how do they get a hold of you? What's the best way? And
Yeah, just go to my website, eylacuenca.com. You can contact me there. If you want to sign up for the class, just go to uncoveringbirth.com. It's very straightforward. That's a really wonderful 6-month container. We do work one-on-one together privately through Zoom, and you have this entire class and this playground to really learn about this whole process. And then, of course, I'm on Instagram and Telegram, Eyla Cuenca Birth.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll link everything in the show notes below. I want to thank you so much for your time, Eyla. I really, really, really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully we can get you back on here soon and dive into some of these things, because I'm sure some of these things are its own podcast in itself. But thank you.
Totally. Yes. Thank you for having me.
What if you could heal most of your ailments by simply breathing or drinking water? Check out episode 21 earlier this month with George Wiseman to learn about his AquaCure AC50 and the healing power of Brown's gas. His machine rehydrogenates your water molecules, reinvigorating you and replenishing your cells, informing your system that it finally has what it needs to fix any deficiencies in your system. You can inhale the gas through the breathing tube provided if you sit at the computer during the day, or recharge the water you drink so your body gets more nutrients if you're on the go. In just 10 minutes, we charge our water here every morning for the day. I now drink nothing else but this. In episode 21, George goes over the many reviews of people who have cleared up numerous physical ailments after using his machine. And George even details a touching story of someone who overcame the very disease that his late wife succumbed to from using this machine he invented. George even talks about how it can help with radiation and even accounts of chemotherapy, so it can potentially help with something about the number 5 and the letter G. This is an unknown gem in the field. If you watch alternative doctors like Amanda Vollmer or Tom Cowan, you can see this machine in the background of their conversations. It's a great way to safeguard your health and well-being and feel better every day. They've been backed up and sold out with the amount of people catching on to this amazing technology. So click the link below and save before they're sold out again. By using the discount code DIGWITHIN, you can save 20% off at the checkout, which is a $500 savings. If you're like me and sometimes have trouble getting a full night's sleep, it's probably just a magnesium deficiency. I take 2 capsules of Bioptimizer's Magnesium Breakthrough and it gives me the best night's sleep of my life. Their magnesium supplement is the best on the market because it's the only one that provides all 7 forms of magnesium in one capsule. Bioptimizers is the #1 selling natural digestive supplements in the market because they're completely natural and small batch produced to ensure the highest quality of their products. Their Masszyme supplement is another one of their best sellers. It helps you digest 3 times more protein that you eat, so it's a must if you're trying to achieve any fitness goals, as well as it's just a great one for everyone to have for general digestion of protein. It helps you save big on buying and eating more protein to feel full. Instead of buying more, digest more. They also have HCl for acid reflux, an amazing probiotic with P3OM, a constipation and herbal parasite cleanse if you're having digestive problems, and Gluten Guardian, an amazing supplement to help you digest gluten if you're having trouble avoiding it, but find yourself, you're at a party or you want to let loose every once in a while. You can bypass that bloated food coma with that, and you'll feel great on cheat meals or cheat days. Some of the best biohackers and holistic health practitioners rave about Bioptimizers, including Paul Chek, Ben Greenfield, and many more. It's definitely worth checking out, and you can save on some bundle deals by using the link below. If you haven't yet, check out last week's episode with Blake Ward over at Seed. They make the best and actual stylish hemp clothing around. They're a conscious hemp clothing, actually fashionable, stylish, and unbelievably comfy. Their harem crotch makes it unisex, super comfy, and easy to wear. They're my favorite thing that I found over the last few years, and the only pants I wear now. What I do is size them up or down depending on what I want to wear them for, and it's not like typical pants where they're way too tight or way too big because they have an elastic waistband and not a traditional button and zipper. And what I absolutely love about the company is that they are made in Cochrane, Alberta, driven to make a change in the world. No part of the process is done in the third world. They're all sewn here locally, and all of their employees make above minimum wage. Head over to theseedstore.ca to grab a pair. They have a 20% discount offer for being a new customer by signing up to their mailing list, and honestly, you're going to love them, so buy as many as you can with that 20% off. And if you want to buy more pairs in the future, you can use my discount code DIGWITHIN to save 15% off on your subsequent orders. How many of you are dreaming about a homestead? Do you know how you would even go about doing that? Have you sat down and planned out how you are going to grow what you want? Do you even know where to start or what you even want? If you have no idea how to do that, check out episode 12 I did with Jim Gale from Food Forest Abundance. Imagine walking out your backyard and having everything you love to eat growing right there for you without having years of experience growing or the hardships of losing crops, stressing about what will work and what won't. Food Forest Abundance specializes in developing a unique permaculture garden in your backyard with their experienced team. You send them info about your space, what you love to eat, what you would want to grow, and they put together a plan to make it a reality. Then they either install it for you, you do it on your own, or a blend of both and work on it together. That way there's no intimidation and you know it's being done correctly by professionals and you will learn how it's done for the future. Food Forest Abundance has even had Entourage star Adrian Grenier contact them, seeing the importance, brilliance, and necessity of what they're doing. In 3 to 4 years, you could have more free food than you know what to do with, all while doing absolutely no work at all. Click the link below to learn more about Food Forest Abundance and start growing your own food. If you're in Ontario and want access to the best possible food you can get your hands on, head over to wildmeadowsfarm.ca for everything that you need. They've got the best grass-fed, grass-finished food that you can find. I love their nose-to-tail ground beef, which is 80% ground beef and 20% organ meats, because organ meats are the best things you can consume. And it's what our ancestors coveted more than anything else when they were hunting. And this is the best way to reintroduce them into your diet. They have everything from chicken, beef, bison, lamb, elk, duck, pepperettes, broth, bones, fermented food, eggs, and dairy. They even have a discount section on their website, as great food is a bit more expensive, so they cater to whatever you need. And also, if you're a bear, head over to the Beartaria Times app to find them in Ontario there, and they offer a discount code only to bears. It's the best food I've found in Ontario, and you won't be disappointed.